Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. The religious left is gaining notoriety as a mass of 2020 presidential campaigns seek to engage with voters. As I record this, the first debates featuring the Democratic candidates is preparing to hit the stage this very evening. How these candidates are speaking to religious communities seems different this time around, and how they continue to speak about religion as the liberal or liberal-leaning candidates could make a big difference for their chances of capturing the White House. In the midst of this resurgence, the history of the religious left is a topic well worth examining. In the 1970s, the religious left looked destined to be successful in the culture war of ideas and at the ballot box for years to come. I've often wondered what happened. Why are liberal politicians re-embracing discussing religion in their candidacies, and why did they ever stop? My topic of conversation today is the rise, fall, and resurgence of the religious left from the 1970s until today. My guest is Dr. L. Benjamin Rolsky. L. Benjamin Rolsky received his PhD from Drew University in American Religious Studies. His work has appeared in a variety of academic and popular venues, including Method and Theory in the Study of Religion and the Journal of American Academy of Religion, as well as the Christian Century, the Los Angeles Review of Books, CNN Opinion, and the Religion and Culture Forum at the University of Chicago. His research and teaching interests include religion and politics, the study of popular culture, and critical theory. Rolsky's first book, The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, Politics, Television, and Popular Culture in the 1970s and Beyond, is forthcoming this fall from Columbia University Press, and you can pre-order it today. He is planning to follow it up with a second book that examines the history of the new Christian right across the 20th century. The religious left rose and fell. In this conversation, we discuss key figures of that rise and fall, such as the story of television producer Norman Lear and People for the American Way. And we also discuss how the religious left is rising again and how high they may rise. Enjoy this conversation with L. Benjamin Rolsky. Dr. L. Benjamin Rolsky, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you very much for having me. I can't wait to do this. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time.
Yeah, me too. It's really great to have you here. Can you just spend a moment and sort of introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit?
Sure. My name is L. Benjamin Rolsky. People probably know me better by Benji. At present, I am a part-time lecturer at Rutgers University in New Brunswick in the religion department. I'm also an adjunct instructor at Monmouth University in history and anthropology. And I'm also a contributor to a number of different websites, including Sacred Matters, HNet Reviews, LA Review of Books, Marginalia Review of Books, and also most recently CNN Opinion. And I might touch on a couple of those things later on in the conversation as well. But for the time being, I'm doing some teaching, doing some writing for both sort of academic and popular audiences, and enjoying it very much.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've been emailing back and forth for some time now. So like I said, it is great to have you here finally, and it's so cool to actually hear your voice on the other end of this thing because
Thank you for having me.
Emailed for so long. And we've talked a lot about, in our emails, about media presence for academics, and you did just refer to some of your popular writing. And so whether academics embrace podcasts or writing articles for large audiences like CNN, I'm curious about your stance on that. Can you tell me a little bit more about your view of trying to reach as big of an audience as you possibly can as somebody who is like immersed in the academy?
Yeah, I think part of it is just sort of a passion that I have just to write and to compose and to think. And so I would say that for me, it's part, strategy in the sense that I want a little bit of exposure, to be sure, a little bit of visibility, certainly keeping in mind the idea of sort of how a lot of that is done, quote unquote, kind of for free. But at the same time, I think in general, I kind of have sort of an ambivalent relationship to it in the sense that I think we do need to employ these certain or different medias, whether it's podcasts, Twitter, that sort of thing. But at the same time, I also think that a lot of that can swallow us up in some capacity, in the sense that we live in this age of kind of crumbling expertise, popularization of things, democratization of things. So it's kind of ironic in the sense that when we reach out to popular audiences through something like Twitter, we're contributing to the very thing that's kind of affecting us to begin with, which is a sense of sort of a crumbling sense of authority or expertise. So I think it kind of cuts in both ways. I think it's really important, but then I also think that we have to be careful about how we engage the public and what idioms and what languages and what voices, because something I also think about is that once we put something out into the world, we live by our own academic standards and expectations, but once we put something out into the world, none of that really applies anymore. And you're held to a much different standard. And I think this is the case, especially when we're trying to speak a particular, perhaps progressive message, and that message has maybe arguably, as I argue in the forthcoming book, I perhaps fallen flat. I think there's the assumption that we do have something to say to the public. I think that's very valuable and needed and important. I think we just have to think about the terms and the grounds upon which we do a lot of that. So, for example, when Colin Kaepernick was taking his stance with the platform that he had, I wrote a little something about how he fits into a longer tradition of protest and radical voices. A number of people equated him to someone like, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. To me at the time, it seemed like it was a much better historical kind of argument to say that his movements and his articulations sort of paralleled those of the Black sort of power moment during the Olympics during the late 60s. And so to me, when we put ourselves out there and put work out there, depending on what our purposes are, if we're just there to kind of lift something up, that's great. But at the same time, if we sort of lack that historical context or accuracy, then our very credibility as kind of academics comes into question. And especially in these times when we're sort of encouraged to be more vocal, encouraged to push back, encouraged to voice, just kind of be wary of the waters that you're wading into, especially with social media, especially with something like Twitter. But I'm certainly for it. I'm certainly someone who uses it, but at the same time, I have an ambivalence as well, just because I know that technology tends to act back on those who are using it, whether we realize it or not. And I think we oftentimes just have to be careful with a lot of that.
Yeah, and a couple months ago, I had Professor at Washburn University on the show, Dr. Chris Jones in the Religious Studies Department, and he and I talked about like the Twitter Storians movement with like Kevin Cruz and the tattooed prof, Kevin Gannon, and how those guys put themselves out there so much, and it's such a complicated thing that they do, but they do it for free. As you mentioned, it is it is unpaid intellectual labor. And so it's really tough. And for me, I do this show just because I think that this is a fun thing to do for me. This is something that I just enjoy doing in my free time. I don't make any money from this. And, I also am not an expert. I just enjoy hearing from people who are experts. Like, that's why I like having these, because I feel like I have so much to learn. But it's also unpaid. All these things we're putting out there. And it's hard work, and it's very challenging to think about doing work that that you will never see anything that will like keep the lights on. So I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad you're willing to spend an hour with me to talk about this stuff, because I am excited to talk about your new book and get into some of the nitty-gritty. So thank you for being here again.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful so far.
Okay, so in the vein of working with, and for a large audience, you study media, religion, religious liberalism, and large cultural events and ideas. So you kind of have a finger on the pulse of many different areas within our society. And within your field of religious studies, how would you describe your area of specialty and kind of what you do every day?
Yeah, so I would say, and this is a little bit of a microcosm of sort of the field a little bit. So I guess content-wise, I've been trained in the study of American religious history. As of late, that's been sort of modified, perhaps to include a variation which would be called American religious studies. I think within history, there's been a movement as of late to kind of push for a little bit more theory, a little bit more self-reflection. So I would say the content is certainly that of religious history, going from say Catholic settlements and the Perry Millers of the world all the way up to Oprah. It's certainly something I do up at Rutgers in how I teach. So I would say that's the content. My exams pre-1865, post-1865. So I'd say that's kind of the landscape, I suppose, the sort of canvas. And then I sort of use that as a sort of a jumping off point to then develop a methodological kind of toolbox. Because as you say, it's fairly widespread. I'm fortunate to be able to sort of take up different objects and be able to unpack them, whether it's in the study of religion or American history or political science or sociology. And so my third and fourth exams in my program were critical theory and study of culture industries and what those tend to do to something like religion, and then the vast sort of sociological literature on the culture wars. Do they exist? Do they not exist? How do they work? How do they not work? So long story short, I suppose I attempt to embody and execute and articulate an interdisciplinary method that uses history as both method but also content. That's an observation coming from someone like Catherine Lofton in the study of, say, American religious studies. So I would say I'm able to take up what I'm able to take up just because I was so deeply influenced by the writings of, say, people like Theodore Adorno and Walter Benjamin and Roland Barthes and that third exam where I looked at the culture industries. And so to me, the way that the Frankfurt School defines something like social prevalence is, I would say, what I do, what I specialize. So I remember writing something on Lofton's book, and I talked about how many different iPods there are that exist today, like the sheer breadth. Yeah, it's unbelievable. And the point of that is to kind of demystify. You don't really realize that's going on, but once you bury into a little bit, you realize, holy cow, there are bazillions of things that have been made. And the culture industry prides itself on being able to identify a surface and perhaps peer below the surface. And so I was just talking to my wife. She's watching a little TV down there, and we hear this ad about, I want it all, this kind of song that's singing along. But listening to something that Zizek would say, something, there's almost an obligation to enjoy. You're almost forced to work to enjoy. Enjoying becomes a form of work and labor. And so I've been deeply kind of influenced by a lot of that, maybe more cynical, maybe critical approaches, those of the Craig Martins of the world and perhaps even the Russell McCutcheons of the world, of that critical approach. But I'm also very attentive to words and sentences and idioms and diction and rhythm. And so I would say the content, just training religious history, but then I've been very intentional to be very interdisciplinary at the same time, which allows me to, like you're saying, have a decent or have a fairly broad sort of view of my subject matter and be able to unpack it for those who will listen, whether in academic settings or more popular settings.
Wonderful. So something that you have, you just mentioned popular settings, and you are sort of going to, I think, become known with your new book, Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, Politics, Television, and Popular Culture in the 1970s and Beyond. You're going to latch on to a figure that is very well known within the popular culture, and that is the man Norman Lear.
That's
and
right.
I've never thought about Norman Lear, like, in my life until I've read this book, because as a child of the 80s and the early 90s, he just sort of missed me as a demographic. Yep. And so I'm curious if you can just remind the audience who Norman Lear is before we discuss the book, and then tell me a little bit about your fascination with his life and his message.
Yeah, so luckily for me, that story was front and center recently on ABC when Jimmy Kimmel and the network decided to reenact, basically put on an episode of All in the Family, an episode of The Jeffersons. So Norman Lear is a television writer, producer, comedian, obviously, in some sense, writer. He was born during the sort of Great Depression era, right around the New Deal, in New Haven, Connecticut, of all places. And he had a number of different jobs in the sort of industry, but before he got to any of those jobs, he actually flew missions in World War II over Italy, I believe. He has this great autobiography that's out. I can't remember the title of it at the moment, but he served in World War II. He came back. He served a little bit, or he worked for Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis for a little bit. Ended up meeting someone like Bud Yorkin, who was a fellow sort of comedian and writer, and put together their own production company. They ended up working on some movies first before something like All in the Family sort of changed America forever, I suppose. And he got into TV, and then he ended up really dominating the 70s. And, like you said, the 80s, 90s, certainly a little bit out of the range, and there's no reason why I would be able to, experience that in the 70s, because I certainly wasn't alive either. But, for whatever reason, my family just tended to show those sorts of shows all the time when I was growing up. So it was really just All in the Family and Mary Tyler Moore and MASH, and this really age of relevance moment when TV was sort of turning back on itself, turning back on society, and trying to show itself to itself. And so Norman Lear is someone who is seen as sort of jump-starting this, and also in many ways starting the idea of sort of appropriating British sitcoms to American audiences. Countless people love The Office, obviously the American version, the British version. Norman started really doing that in the 70s with All in the Family and even something like Sanford and Son. So for people who don't know, he did Sanford and Son, or he at least produced things like Sanford and Son, The Jeffersons, Maude, All in the Family, Mary Hartman, One Day at a Time. And those really dominated the 70s, with All in the Family really almost being on the entire decade. And if you just think for a moment that there were only 3 networks at the time that broadcast this type of stuff, and the sheer numbers of people who watched these programs, anyone who pays attention to TV history knows obviously of the MASH finale and how many people watched that. So this is the moment that we're really talking about. And Norman Lear's front and center to this sort of revolution in television programming. It was certainly supported by the networks as well because they needed to make money. So it wasn't as if it was just this altruistic kind of thing. Norman Lear trying to make this kind of self-aware television. It was sort of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The networks can be in on it, and we can make and sort of remake television. So in a lot of ways, that's where Norman's coming from. He saw 50s and 60s TV as rather sort of vacuous in his opinion, and he wanted to sort of flip the script in many ways. And so that's what he's arguably known for.
A moment ago, you said a term, age of relevance. What is that?
So I define, and also, I guess, in reading or doing the dissertation, which is where a lot of this book comes from, you're reading sort of television histories and media studies. There's a moment that historians, analysts, scholars call the age of relevance. And so I tend to broaden that out a little bit more and include more of the mid-60s up through, say, the mid-70s. You look in the sort of 60s literature, academic literature during civil rights, relevance is a thing in the air. Obviously, pastors are leaving their churches in the name of relevance because we have this relevance in front of us, not unlike what's going on today, and the draw to social media and to reach broader audiences. We just have to think about the terms and grounds upon which that takes place, I think. So to me, relevance really comes out of that moment. Lear sort of channels that in some way, whether he would admit it or not, I'm not necessarily sure, but I sort of contextualize his programming as an outgrowth of what's happening during the quote-unquote movement. We're trying to make things more relevant, more pertinent, not just for social reasons, but also economic reasons. The networks figure out that, there's a new demographic out there that is young, that is hip, that wants to be informed, and so we want to give them programming that will be able to feed and sort of satisfy that desire. Here comes Norman Lear. I want to do some TV that's going to put a bigot on television. Okay, so in some ways we have a bit of a coming together of the minds, even though Lear would fight against standards and practices in the very first episode of the entire show. But basically the age of relevance, to be more specific just to the early 70s, is really when TV becomes less about programming in itself and begins to become beholden to a larger kind of vision, socioeconomic, political, religious vision. And I use Lear to sort of get at that. But to me, it's really, you have Mary Tyler Moore, you have MASH, and you have All in the Family. And those are all on at the same time and really took off at the same time. And that's what relevance was. It was about talking about Korea, but really talking about Vietnam. It was talking about taking birth control on television through someone like Mary Tyler Moore. And it was also about talking about discrimination and bigotry, really taking the headlines of the time and turning them into plots and turning them into dramatic programming for hundreds of millions of people every week.
And if you talk about it on TV, it really makes people more likely to talk about it in their personal lives and in their friendships as well. And it kind of just moves the whole conversation forward. What was the moment when you were like a doctoral student where you're like, I'm going to write a dissertation and then a book about Norman Lear? Like, what was that decision process like?
Well, looking back, I've thought about that a lot in the sense of what topics would be maybe safer to do and what topics would be perhaps more risky or difficult to pull off. So I would say I was fortunate enough to take some classes with Professor Lofton, and her Oprah book was coming out at the time. So I was kind of shaped to think in terms of figures, or to think in terms of figures who are both in and out of religious spaces, secular spaces, however we render them. And so I was kind of opened up in that sense to be able to do that. But most specifically, it was really finding out that something like People for the American Way, which is Norman Lear's nonprofit, which we can talk a little about if you'd like, forms in the early 80s. When I found out that really came about because Lear had something against the televangelists of the late 70s, Falwell, Robertson, Robeson, Reagan, obviously not a televangelist, but when I found that out, and I found out the connection between the generation of that nonprofit and its interfaith composition and its support by people like Martin Marty and people like Donald and Peggy Shriver of Union Theological Seminary, I began to see Norman Lear as being the focal point of a larger network of religious and political, or religious and progressive liberals who are trying to find themselves almost amidst this moment of Thatcher across the pond, of Reagan, of things overturning, of really discombobulation on a mass kind of scale. So I don't think I really thought about it strategically, to be completely honest, in the sense of academia and how it operates. That was really never in my thought. I don't know if I would have done things differently, in light of the fact that a lot of the public work I'm doing is an attempt to perhaps find work that is both academic and not at the same time. So that's also just an act of kind of just survival and acting on one's passion in some sense. So I don't know if I were to think about that a little bit more, but it was really just that connection and knowing that I could make that work, and I could use Lear as a kind of microcosm of something much bigger that I wanted to talk about. So far, so good.
Well, it's really interesting, too, because if you just think about the moment of discovering, wow, the most popular television producer of an entire decade has something against Jerry Falwell. What's up with that? You know what I mean? That's such a compelling question. Why? Tell me more. Okay, so your new book, when is it coming out again?
November 12th.
Okay, great. Columbia University Press, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so the book is called Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, Politics, Television, and Popular Culture in the 1970s and Beyond. So I am fortunate to have been able to read a few advanced chapters of the book, so thank you for that. So I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit about what the terms in your title, Rise and Fall, mean to you.
Rise and Fall certainly came after I finished a lot of the edits, a lot of the sort of peer review, a lot of the back and forth. It took me a little while, I think, to kind of see the change over time that I was after. It was certainly in discussion with the press as well as trying to find a good title. I certainly wanted to focus on something like the religious left or spiritual left, or something that people like Lee Schmidt and others have sort of investigated. I knew it was going to be something like that, but as far as the rise and fall, I think that ends up better encapsulating or capturing what I'm after, in the sense that I don't know how well we really understand how we go from someone like Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, being these big figures in the 60s, and then all of a sudden by the late to mid 70s we get people like Falwell and Robertson. Falwell gives this famous speech in the 60s saying the gospel has nothing to do with anything social, yet less than a decade later he's the CEO of the moral majority. How did that happen? I still think that we're sort of struggling with that, or we're still trying to figure that out in some capacity. And so for me, if we're talking about things historically, this book isn't necessarily purely historical. It's a little bit more about a cross-section within a given time. There's certainly change over time, say the early 70s to the early 80s. That's kind of where we go from Norman Lear as religious liberal to Lear, founder of People for the American Way. So there certainly is change over time, but I'm also interested in taking sort of cross-sections out of moments. So I think we get this wonderful rise of relevance and the movement coming out of the 60s. And people, what happened to the spirit? Did Kent State really destroy it? There's this great documentary that I watched that, the day the 60s died is with Kent State. What happened to that? Where did it go? People have answered that differently. Did things become more radicalized? Did it become more capitalized, consumerized? I just wrote a encyclopedia entry for the Oxford Encyclopedia online for history on the 1970s. They're usually known as the me decade, people turning in and dropping out, pet rocks and chia pets and all these sorts of things. So what really happened there, and why do we get this kind of falling away, in the sense that, I wouldn't necessarily, for the book it is rise and fall, but I think if you're conservative in this period, it's not a fall at all. If anything, it's an ascent. If anything, it's a moment of mobilization and organization over against a movement that's maybe petering out. And how does that happen? And why do those who, say, bring in marketers and advertisers to remake the Republican Party, something I'm thinking about for a second project coming down the road, why do they come in and basically remake religion in public along conservative lines? We get Roe v. Wade. Obviously, there are arguments about what takes place with the mobilization of this conservatism or that conservatism. I think in some ways what I'm trying to get at, rise and fall, what happened to that moment? What happened to that energy? And I use Lear to kind of get at the strengths of that and also kind of the shortcomings of that and the falling away of that. And Daniel Bell, sociologist, talks about a transition from class to culture. If you want to be more controversial, you say class to identity, if you'd like, and all the arguments and debates about identity. But for him, you kind of lose that class emphasis of maybe talking to someone like Archie Bunker, maybe asking him what his concerns are, or wondering why his paycheck is shrinking every week and every month and why he's having difficulty finding work, and losing the ability to talk to that person. You'd rather make that person the butt of a joke on something like All in the Family instead of actually entertaining that person. And I realize that saying those things today is somewhat sort of challenging in the sense of the times that we live in. But I think that fall, part of the reason that fall is you begin to lose touch with a wide range of individuals in this country. And so that's some of the stuff I want to explore later. But that's what I mean by the rise and the fall, is that what happened to that? And then more importantly, perhaps, what can we learn from that moving forward? Are we okay with simply winning, quote-unquote, culture wars and losing elections? I don't necessarily know. I think people are rethinking that seriously right now.
Okay, so there is a lot of stuff about winning and losing in this context, like whose ideas win, whose ideas lose. What do certain ideas win culturally but lose electorally? That's such a fascinating question. And then you write in the 1970s that the religious left's rise seemed destined to succeed. But then you say that the religious left stopped taking the religious right's arguments seriously, labeling them as extremists. Do you think that if they had kept the door more open, that there might have been less division in society, and then the liberal ideas would have won anyway, and then there would be more victory as far as like electorally?
That's hard to say. I love the focus on ideas. So I think for this next project I'm thinking about, certainly maybe coming out of the Cold War, and certainly the importance of ideas. If you're teaching in sort of a general survey sense, we talk about obviously Cold War as a war of ideas, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, you read these sort of conservative strategists who are coming in, they see it as basically warfare. It's not warfare, but for many of them, it is warfare. And that's a very different understanding of politics than those who are trying to broaden the circle or speak a prophetic message to the public square as its defenders and its maintainers. So to me, it is a lot about winning and losing. And that's why I talked a little bit about messaging and marketing, because to me, I know it's maybe oversimplified, but in a lot of ways, we can understand the ascent of someone like Reagan, arguably as the product of a really well-run marketing and sort of advertising campaign. I've written a little bit about that on behalf of, I can't remember where, but I looked a little bit at how Jared Kushner kind of organized the campaign and how he used things like Facebook Live and Google Maps and all these things to really focus in on the places so that we could get a quote-unquote return on investment. So it's not so much, we want to bring people in. It's more, what can we do to get the most on our return? And that's been a certain, I think, entrepreneurial way of thinking for conservative Protestants ever since, say, Scopes in some ways. Because the story of Lear is that Lear had the FCC behind him. Lear had the power of the state, of the federal government, which had created these rules to keep people like the Father Coughlin's or Coughlin's of the world off the radio in the 20s and 30s. So there's a lot at play here. And as far as the winning and the losing and of ideas, it's hard for me, or it's difficult for me to sort of admit, but a lot of it has to do with just messaging about who best spoke to the American people. And I think as conservatism was getting off the ground, I think those on the left weren't really sure what to do in the 70s. And I think once Reagan was elected, there was a sort of collective washing of hands. How on earth could have this happened? How did you let this happen? especially in light of this New York Times article that came out a little while ago, maybe a year or two ago, that it's an amazing title. It says something like religious liberals have sat out of politics for the last 40 years, but now they want back in the game. It's an amazing narrative because it so much mirrors the narrative of Pentecostals and fundamentalists basically going underground for half a century. Well, now we can kind of look at religious liberals as also sort of participating in their own exodus from the public square. But what's more complex is that those liberals are the very ones invested in the idea of something like the public square over and against the ideas of privatization, of corporatization of the right. So to me, that's why this is so fascinating, just because it has much less to do with sort of reaching as many people as possible, but what your very conception of politics is. Is it this kind of expansive thing, or is it really about, no, this is, might not be guns and bullets and stuff, but this is warfare. It's a war of ideas, like you're saying, and whoever wins is going to arguably shape the public script of what we define religion as.
So you've name-dropped a lot of organizations and people. You mentioned Reagan a minute ago, the Moral Majority, the Christian Nation, and also Lear. So I want to bring all those figures back together because in the very beginning of the book, you start the book by quoting from a 1984 letter from Norman Lear to then-President Ronald Reagan, in which he writes about how deeply troubled he is by Reagan's endorsement of the surging religious right movement. So I'm curious how significant Lear was in critiquing movements like Christian Nation, the Moral Majority, and television evangelists. Like, was he prominently public at this time? Like, was this something that people in the country were talking about? How is Lear situated in the moment?
Yeah, so this is where history is helpful in the sense that early 70s, there's not a lot of him saying anything about any of those folks. Obviously, just historically, we know that most of that doesn't take off till the mid to late 70s anyway. But the moment, or the sort of through line, is that Lear he's of a certain age so that he remembers things like McCarthy, he remembers things like blacklists, he remembers what that did to Hollywood. He remembers what it was like growing up near Yale and having to hear things about quotas relative to Jewish students, having grown up listening to an anti-Semite like Coughlin, like Coughlin, very much has this idea of Jewishness or Judaism, just to sort of speak a little bit about that, as something that has to do with sort of being ostracized, discriminated against, something like that. So that's why People for the American Way is very much a First Amendment nonprofit. Lear is very much in defense of freedom, religious freedom, artistic freedom. So that's the bedrock kind of that a lot of this is grounded upon. It's very civically oriented. It's a very civil religious kind of understanding of things. He tells a story about how either a grandfather or uncle used to write letters to the president every week, or when he didn't like something, "Dear Mr. President," here you go. So it was very like civically oriented kind of understanding of things.
Okay.
That's the kind of the bedrock, and then these individuals, the folks that you were mentioning, kind of challenge or compromise those very freedoms that he has paid so dearly to protect and invest in, and then that takes off a little bit as we get into the 70s. But that's kind of the bedrock, and once we get deeper into the decade, then we begin to kind of hear about him being more critical. He sues the networks for something called the Family Viewing Hour, which is an attempt to kind of curtail what content was okay to show or not show at a certain time. He thought that was censorship. So he has a very strong kind of First Amendment streak that then gets targeted or directed at people like a Falwell or Robertson. There's a moment where he's hearing one of those individuals pray for the removal of a Supreme Court justice, and there's very much this transformation of, wow, this cannot be happening. I have to do something about it. And he was going to make a movie at first with the help of people like Robin Williams and Richard Pryor, but decided to go in a different direction. So I make the argument that Lear helped bring a lot of liberal religious people together in the sense that he was almost a leader, in a sense, of calling these sorts of individuals out in public. You can look at something like All in the Family as kind of being civically oriented in the sense that we put a bigot in front of people because we don't agree with the bigot. It's because we're trying to learn something from the bigot. So there's something didactic about it. So that's a broader kind of bedrock. And then once the evangelists come about, Lear becomes very specific in particular about religion and freedom of religion. And then that sort of reminds him about also listening to Coughlin and his own sort of existence as a Jewish individual in Hollywood. He's very aware of how that looks to everyone. He's talked about that in public. So to me, he's someone who's giving a little bit of a banner, holding a banner in a lot of ways, and serving as an example or exemplar of how to sort of critique or attack these sort of threats to democracy in his mind.
Okay, so I want to come back to Charles Coughlin in just a second, but first, what are Lear's personal religious beliefs insofar as he was willing to divulge them?
So he was certainly he certainly had a bar mitzvah. I can't remember where, somewhere in New York, I think, but he grew up more or less in Connecticut, various parts of Connecticut, and mostly in New Haven. Certainly exposed to an extended Jewish family, no question about that. Uncles, aunts, a lot of things in Yiddish. So very much sort of steeped in that kind of upbringing. But then at the same time, I guess not unlike my own kind of family or my own sort of dad in some ways, not sort of emphasized per se, or you ask him, what does this do for you? Or how do you understand being Jewish or Judaism? It's not something that is necessarily emphasized or front and center. I think it's something that comes up in certain particular moments, say when Lear is reminded of the fact that he had to listen to something growing up, or he sees a moment of exclusion, a moment of, or an instance of, say, the infringement of what textbooks can be used in the classroom. So to him, a lot of it still comes back to that kind of defense of sort of First Amendment freedoms, but then at the same time coming from certainly a Jewish place, but then also, I would say, a spiritual or religious place as well. I don't think he would refer to himself as a religious person. He certainly has talked about mystical experiences and spiritual experiences, so that's why I used a lot of the writings on sort of the history of American spirituality. He purchased the estate of Robert Frost some years ago, and since the early 1980s, he's organized a pilgrimage every year during President's Day, I think, or some holiday during the year where he invited people like the sort of intelligentsia at the time, the Martys, the Maya Angelous. And these people would come together and really pontificate and think about, what does worship mean? What does religion mean? He's a big admirer of the Emersons and the Whitmans and the Thoreaus. So there's a lot of what sort of David Hollinger talks about as having a foot in one tradition and then the other foot as being able to explore other traditions as well, sort of a sampling, a bit of a cosmopolitan, sensibility that I think he would admit is somewhat maybe spiritual, somewhat Jewish, but necessarily not exclusively one or the other, and not mutually exclusive either, if that makes any sense.
Gotcha. Okay, so, and he grows up in this Jewish family in this time period where Father Charles Coughlin is like on the radio and everywhere, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so what was Coughlin saying that was memorable to Lear as Lear reaches adulthood and moves into a position of power in society?
Yeah, so he grows up listening to his crystal radio. And so he used to sit next to his dad in his dad's chair, which is the very same chair that you see really in All in the Family. The show is very autobiographical. Lear put a lot of himself into that. And so he has these wonderful memories of listening sort of to boxing matches with his dad, but then also to listening to fireside chats and listening to FDR and hearing things about the New Deal. And at the same time, Lear is also hearing the words of Coughlin as well. And to him, it's forming him in the sense of it was the first time that he heard himself sort of as an outsider. Or it was a moment when he sort of conceived himself as, okay, I guess I'm not necessarily literally part of what this person is talking about, or I feel removed in some capacity. And then I think he was reminded of that, or that was emphasized even more. And I think he maybe talks about this in his autobiography, having to live in and around a school that's having something to do with quotas, and with those quotas being directed to Jewish individuals in particular. And I think he ends up writing or winning, actually, an essay contest in which he's writing about, I think, the First Amendment or the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, something like that. And he ends up winning the contest, and he gets to go to Emerson, I think, college. He ends up getting to go to college, which doesn't last very long because then he has to go to World War II. But he ends up winning this and writing. And I think that moment, which also gave birth to someone like someone who Adorno studies, Martin Luther Thomas. So you have a number of sort of preachers at this time, not unlike the late 70s, kind of, who are at times referred to as being anti-Semitic, as being against Jewish individuals and Jewish life just in general. In the mid 70s, there's a famous quote from the Southern Baptist Convention president at the time: "God does not hear the prayer of a Jew." So I think there's a lot of resonance that takes place between the times of the 20s and 30s and the times of the 70s and 80s that Lear is able to literally experience, because his life, sort of covers that whole swath of time. So I think it certainly shaped his thinking about himself in a way that he maybe would have preferred not to learn about per se, as far as being perpetually perhaps on the outside. But then I think it also undergirded what he ended up doing in the 70s and being so virulent and such a defender of these sort of First Amendment rights as he understood them.
So Lear is experiencing these things growing up. He's having these experiences. He's doing these mystical experiences. He's reading across religious lines. And he founds his nonprofit, his First Amendment nonprofit, People for the American Way. So it seems like to me he values a civil religious vision surrounded around religious pluralism as a foundation for like a liberal democracy. And I'm curious if what his like philosophy is for how he views what the United States should be as a place for people of all religions. Like, what is his major goal?
Yeah, I think so. That's a really good question. I think you see it a little bit in the shows. I think he's trying to shape a particular consciousness, or at least introduce ideas into the world that he doesn't see there otherwise. And that's why he was such a fascinating figure, in the sense that I could really talk about a similar set of sort of contributions that he makes through different places, through his television programming, through his nonprofit work, through his sort of suing of the federal government. So it was just a really nice way of illustrating what he's after, which, as you say, is a pluralistic vision, for sure. It's a religious pluralism, a political pluralism, a civil religious pluralism, civil religious vision. Unfortunately, a lot of that can be leveraged. I know someone like David Chittister has talked about civil religion as an articulation of power, or a certain assemblage or organizing of governance. That might be a little grandiose, but I think it's helpful in the sense that Lear saw someone like Falwell or Robertson as an outsider, or someone who was an extremist, or someone who could upset or overturn the apple cart, as it were, because he didn't necessarily play by the rules. For someone like Lear, there are rules, and I would argue, to abstract it out, that liberal democracy has certain rules. The Winifred Sullivans of the world, people who study liberal democracy, there are certain rules that come along with existing as a quote-unquote person of faith or religious person. Tisa Wenger writes, what is religion? What's not religion? So for Lear, the shortcomings, he could have this wonderful, beautiful vision, but what I sort of talk about the fall is that conservative individuals really aren't part of that vision. And if those look back at Robert Bella's original article from the late 60s, he actually uses, and I never realized this, the John Birch Society as a pole against which to define civil religion. I don't know if civil religion has really been contextualized in that way, but I would argue that because he creates this binary, for reasons that are understandable, obviously, but as far as the theoretical and conceptual kind of validity of all of it, you look back at the article and he's using Birchers, and I think he also says nationalist movements or something like that, as a foil against which to create this thing called civil religion, which is then enshrined in various legislation decisions and in various documents. So that's certainly his goal, and his vision is to kind of, as this one sociologist says, to protect the liberal deep story, to protect the public square, to protect public goods. Because at the time, those public goods are being dismantled. More and more sort of conservative arguments and neoliberal arguments are sort of dismantling public, and we're still trying to figure that out in many ways. But that's kind of the shortcoming, I argue, is that in these civil religious articulations and pluralistic articulations, you don't really have a room or a voice for someone like maybe an Archie Bunker or someone like a Falwell. Not to obviously condone or anything, but there's this great anecdote where Falwell acknowledges that Lear creates people for the American way, but instead Falwell calls it people for Norman Lear's way. So I think there's some truth to that, and that's part of the dimensions of the fall that I get into. On whose behalf are we constructing this pluralistic society, and how is it going to operate? And so that's why the last chapter of the book, Lear puts on this variety show that's almost like civil religion. It's almost like a play. It's almost like a variety show, like a civil religion variety show or something like that, with the different values that we're meant to uphold. Non-discriminatory, interreligious, these sorts of things. So it was wonderfully aspirational and beautiful in its composition and its intent. There's just unfortunately a bit of a weakness in that entire apparatus that I try and give voice to.
What's really interesting is that Lear puts a character like Archie Bunker on television explicitly to put those ideas out there because he sees those ideas as not being supposed to survive into the future. And so you also have this quote on page 4 of your book where, when talking about people for the American way, you write that they monitor potentially abrasive language in the public square while facilitating civil deliberation on behalf of the nation's religious minorities. And then you just talked about how Falwell almost feels like left out. Does that complicate the situation here?
It does, yeah, and that's my very, very point, in the sense that I don't certainly want to be seen as coming to the defense of anything or trying to speak to those who can defend themselves or anything like that. But I think part of the study, or part of what I'm trying to point out, is just how the system itself is kind of bent against or designed against conservative actors. Arguably going back to something like the 20s and 30s with Coughlin, obviously for the correct reasons, but in a lot of ways, Peter Berger writes this article in the late 70s, early 80s, and he uses the phrase to describe televangelists. He uses the phrase Ayatollahs of the airwaves. So I think there's something to that. And scholar, a dear friend of mine, David Watt, has written just this beautiful book on anti-fundamentalist arguments. And Lear is very much a part of that tradition, and so is someone like Martin Marty, in the sense of Lear and others represent a particular place and voice. It's not an abstracted Enlightenment place of nowhere. It's a very embodied, physical, taste, class-based position. And that's kind of what I'm trying to draw out a little bit. And like I said, I'm not trying to, arguments today about religious freedom and how and sort of conservative interests are being supported by these things. I don't want to be read or seen to be speaking to any of that just because of the times that we sort of happen to live in. But at the same time, the system itself is kind of bent in certain directions. And Falwell wanted to actually be part of the I Love Liberty variety show. And he actually reached out to someone like Lear. But Lear, of course, said no. And he said we didn't want any speeches or we didn't want any lectures. All the while, ABC is giving Lear millions of dollars to produce this variety show. So for a lot of journalists and academics, not so much, but conservative commentators, this was a conflict of interests. This was an example of ABC kind of basically funding a nonprofit organization's extended commercial, basically for itself. And so that's a lot of what this is about, is pointing out those kind of dynamics and maybe seeing individuals who we're used to hearing about in different lights. Someone like Falwell, perhaps, or just the relationship between the two men, in the sense that they were reported on a lot together in the public eye. You could even say that Lear was maybe helped. His visibility in the late 70s was helped because he was tethered to Falwell, even though both of them played it down. Falwell did call Norman Lear the number one enemy of the family in America. So there's a lot to be said about that, about the imbrication, about the inextricability of these two men and sort of what they're attempting to do at the time.
Does Lear actually see what he's doing as religious in nature, or does he just view it as activism? Because the book is about the religious right, the religious left, culture wars. Yeah. How does Lear see and view what he's doing? Is it religious or not?
I think it is, and then I think it isn't. I think there's a tendency maybe on the proverbial, whatever we would call religious left or spiritual left, to certainly say that, yes, I come from a place of sort of social justice and the gospel applies to social conditions and we're going to make that possible and make that happen. So in some ways, he is by default a part of that kind of tradition in the sense that texts just don't speak to individual transformation. They can also speak to the world around us. So in some sense, you could locate him in that larger, longer kind of tradition. You know, he basically took TV and tried to apply it, or tried to take this larger vision and apply it to television. So it's very much kind of modernist application of method. You know, how are we going to use the tools around us to reach out to those around us? Now, I think it can also be, I think it would maybe depend on the issue or the particular cause. I think Lear, or if you were to ask him, I think he would say it's just part of his duty as an American. Certainly his sort of commitment to the First Amendment. I think it's really blurry in the sense that, yes, it is activism, but it's also kind of spiritual activism. It's religious activism, especially if it has to do with discrimination in any kind of sense, which I think is why perhaps there's still so much sort of misunderstanding about the relationship between religion and politics and the proper relationship. Because Lear wrote, or People for the American Way wrote countless books on the proper ways of mixing religion and politics together. And so the presumptuousness that comes with that, it's sort of prescribed. It's a certain formula how the two are supposed to go together. But I think as far as we talk about what the religious left is or isn't, I think there's something to be said about that. Are we clear about how to translate the prophetic into the pragmatic? The left tends to see itself as speaking from a prophetic place, certainly a place of relevance. I just wonder how that's worked, if it's been as clear as it could be, especially this sort of age that we live in, which seems to be continually defined by someone like Reagan. So for me, I think it would vary, and that might be part of the amorphousness that sort of comes with religious liberal activism, is that you don't necessarily, there's no real sort of definitive yes this or yes that. I think it's kind of sort of a blend of all of it.
I want to sort of end today on a conversation about here and now, 2019. Mm-hmm. We live in this, the news every day is very strange. It's often troubling. But we have this sort of resurgence about discussion of the religious left as sort of coming back. So, we might have like a rise and a fall and a rise again. You never know. So we have news reports of like migrant kids being held in cages or without access to toothbrushes or enough water. We have travel bans that have been, tied to religion, rollback of EPA regulations, while also religious groups have been fighting for environmental concerns. The list goes on. So we're on the cusp of another presidential election, and I see coverage of the religious left more and more. So, like, I see somebody like Reverend William Barber, the vast coverage of the candidate Pete Buttigieg. I've been following the journalism of Jack Jenkins and Kelsey Dallas a whole bunch lately. And so I see the religious left as being discussed in ways I haven't seen before in my lifetime of caring about this topic. Like, do you see it that way? Is this an exciting time to be writing and researching about this topic of the religious left?
It is. I think it could be, maybe it's the most important time, perhaps the most significant time, to perhaps really figure out what it's about, what it is, what it's not. Yes. So in some capacity, I think we have to be wary of, and I think people have written about this, the idea of, Democrats just have to talk about religion more, or something like that. I think we have to be careful because I think since the 80s or since the late 70s, we've really played, we being those who are interested in, say, progressive activism or the potentials or the theoretical kind of capacities. I think for a good deal of time, a lot of that movement has played on terms not of its own definition. So I think in some capacity, if you just push for more religion, quote unquote, whatever that means, you're almost reproducing your own irrelevance. I think you have to be very clear as to what you're trying to say and why you're trying to say it to the public. We talked earlier about why we communicate with the public and different publics. I think there's maybe at times assumption that we have an obligation, that we have a commitment, which we do, I think, in a lot of ways, to educating, to spreading a broader word. I just think we have to be careful. I think we have to be clear as to what the message is, or what it would be, and if it could be as clear as possible. I think it's a really, really exciting time. But I also think that there also is a moment of, okay, this is somewhat maybe happened before. Talked about the rise and the fall. If we're, anyone is a Twin Peaks fan in here or over the airwaves here, it's sort of happening again in the sense that we have this relevance moment in the 60s, and now we have another moment, which was kind of largely inaugurated in some sense by the Times article that we talked a little bit about, which I didn't really realize was in the air at the time. And it just gave me so much to think about. So I think, yes, it's a really important time. I think it's a time to be very attentive and very reflective about the terms that we use, why we use those particular terms, whose interests are we actually representing. So I've written a little bit about Mayor Pete. I think the fact that someone like Jim Wallace is still kind of referred to or still kind of invited or still sought after is a little bit maybe a little problematic. I think in some capacity he's been saying similar things since at least the late 60s or early 70s. In fact, I think progressive evangelicals were really the ones sort of trying to get the voice out in the early 70s, the Social Declaration of Evangelical Concern. So nothing historically says that the right should have overtaken the public script as they did. So I think we have to understand that process better. I think we have to think about more, messaging. I think we have to think about, for those who are interested in sort of applying a lot of this to organizing, about congregations and churches, those sorts of things. I think it's really a moment of reflection, because I think this moment is certainly bringing a lot of this out in some capacity. I wonder if, this moment, if things were a little bit different, less divided, if we've had such a discussion of something called the religious left. So it brings up wonderful questions about the relationship between what's going on around us and how people respond to those conditions. But I think it's very complex. I think there's a little bit at times some nostalgia, thinking that we can just resurrect what happened during the civil rights movement, or just assume that those individuals on the right side of sort of justice and human history, and so there's no need to defend those sorts of things. I think in some ways, like we talked a little about earlier, there's an opportunity to sharpen and hone arguments and how to speak to broader audiences in this moment. If you're thinking along the lines of religious left or trying to articulate yourself in that capacity, I think it is really exciting. It's also very challenging and complex, but it could lead to any number of exciting developments, and certainly we'll be along there for the ride.
Well, if there's anybody out there listening from any presidential, House of Representatives, or Congress campaigns, you should hire Dr. Benjamin Rolsky as an advisor, potentially bring him on board so he can teach you all about this. So, Dr. Rolsky, where can people find you if they want to follow your work, get in touch, or know more about what you are doing?
Well, it's almost as if you read my mind, and I appreciate that, because in the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, Rutgers University is putting together a panel of experts who journalists can refer to, newspaper people, magazines, anyone who has any questions about issues and topics of religion or culture or politics or the interstitial kind of relationship between all that stuff. And I just happen to be appointed to that panel.
Yes.
So I, in fact, will be, if those who are interested, reaching out, I will be handling kind of the religion stuff. I think there's a website that they will put up in time. But yeah, they're getting a little bit ahead of the game, and they want to make people, I guess, like myself, available to journalists and those who might have questions about what's forthcoming. So I really appreciate your endorsement and the sort of beautiful segue. And as far as the religious left, there should be an imminent frame forum, which is connected to the Social Science Research Council. The imminent frame being a wonderful interdisciplinary space of analysis and conversation. There should be a forum on the religious left coming out sometime soon that I'll be a part of. And then I have something on Fox News. Someone wrote this really great book, or this colleague of mine, Reese Peck, wrote this great book called Fox News, Branding Conservatism as Working Class. That piece will come out with the Los Angeles Review of Books at some point. It's a really great book. I think it's a central reading for anyone trying to understand how conservatism functions as an idiom, as a language, as a discourse. Just a wonderful book. And other than that, I'm hoping for good things with the book in November. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you very much for your own time and your own work and your own efforts and putting this together. People in my field have been really looking closely at what you're doing, and just know it's appreciated. I appreciate it, and a number of other people appreciate it as well. So I just want to thank you for that.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for those kind words. Hey, really quick, is the book available for pre-order? Can people find it and order it already, or is that coming soon?
Yes, the book is available. Actually, I should have said something like that. So I have a website, just my name, benjirolsky.com. It is available for pre-order. You can do it through Columbia. You can also do it through Amazon. I think even Barnes & Noble has it up now. I think there's a hardcover and a paperback version.
Oh, great!
I think it's around $35, so it's not crazy. So people can certainly go ahead and order to their heart's content. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you so much, sir. This has been a really great chat. I'm so glad to have had you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really, really had a great time.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.